In Aotearoa, New Zealand, over 90,000 students are enrolled in state integrated schools. Of those, about 65,000 attend Catholic schools. That means 11.5% of all students and their whānau are able to choose a state integrated education that encompasses the values, religious beliefs, philosophies, and customs that are important to them. A long history and many dedicated custodians contributed to the development of our flourishing state integrated school network, and knowing our journey is key to understanding the role and responsibilities we have in our community today. Our beginnings go back to 1816 in the Bay of Islands, when Anglican missionary Thomas Kendall opened the first European-style school. Over the next 3 decades, many more missionary schools were established around Aotearoa. Unfortunately, Catholic students were not always welcome in Protestant schools, so the Catholic bishop in Aotearoa looked to the community to establish schools of their own. In 1841, New Zealand's first Catholic school was opened in Auckland, which was also the only school in Auckland at the time. And by the 1870s, there were approximately 50 Catholic schools operating in New Zealand, many receiving funding from the government. 1877 saw the introduction of the Education Act. This created free, secular, compulsory primary education for children, though it was only compulsory for Pākehā students. While this was a largely positive development, one consequence of this was the removal of state aid for private, church-run schools. Protestant schools were able to continue to receive funding by legally closing their schools during religious instruction. However, Catholic bishops were committed to a school system where Catholic character was imbued in all aspects of the curriculum and throughout the school day. Therefore, they decided to create a private Catholic education system, largely staffed by members of overseas congregations and funded by the church and parent communities. This marked the beginning of a 70-year battle to gain support for state aid for private schools. Initial arguments promoting state aid centered around 2 main points. The first highlighted the involvement of churches in the early success of schooling in New Zealand, while the second point focused on the idea that state aid to private schools was important for equity and natural justice. This was because Catholic parents were already contributing to state education through taxes, and then paying fees and donations to their Catholic private schools on top of that. However, all of these attempts were rebuffed as the original principles in the 1877 Education Act of a free, secular, compulsory education system were well entrenched in both educational and political philosophies. On top of this, there was concern that private schools would compete with public schools for limited resources and lower the quality of state education. The shared experiences of New Zealanders during World War II helped to break down sectarian barriers in Aotearoa, and church authorities began to work together to achieve state aid for their schools. But the population boom that followed the war and the raising of the school leaving age to 15 meant that resources in Catholic schools were increasingly stretched. More lay teachers needed to be employed and properties needed to be adapted or expanded. Obviously, this further increased the financial burden on communities, parishes and parents. Despite the new unity among different denominations and the common challenges for church schools and their communities, advocacy for state aid did not bring about any change in the 15 years following World War II. In 1960, the Nash government instructed the Curry Commission to consider state aid to private schools. And despite the Commission recommending no change, this showed that the advocacy work had made an impact due to political pressure by constituents on their politicians. In 1962, Protestant secondary schools joined with Catholic schools to set up the Interdenominational Committee of Independent Schools. This led to some success in receiving grants for heating, lighting, school equipment, water rates, and salaries for ancillary staff. The Second Vatican Council, held between 1962 and 1965, resulted in many Catholic priests, sisters and brothers moving away from teaching to pursue parish work. This further increased the reliance on and cost of lay teachers in Catholic schools. The schools were unable to pay the lay teachers at the same rate as state schools could, and so the roles were largely filled by staff who were retired or part-time. The problems of insufficient staffing and poor classroom facilities meant that in this period it was normal to find class sizes of 60 students or more. Unsurprisingly, all of this had an impact on the quality of education at Catholic schools, and their roles began to fall as Catholic families opted to send their children to free state schools instead. Unfortunately, further attempts by church authorities to get the government to consider full state aid to private schools were not successful until the 1970s. Labour MPs Norman Kirk and Jonathan Hunt were aware of the appalling conditions in many Catholic schools. Class sizes were as high as 80 students, and religious orders undertook most of the jobs required, from teaching to caretaking and cleaning. Hunt and Kirk saw the plight of private schools as a problem of equity and justice, and believed it was unfair for Catholic students to receive an inferior education to those in state schools. While in opposition in 1969, Kirk announced that if elected, the Labour government would initially subsidise salaries of teachers in private schools, and eventually integrate them into the state system. After successfully winning the 1972 election, now Prime Minister Norman Kirk followed through, and in 1973 Minister of Education Phil Amos convened a working party to resolve this issue. And in December 1974, the working party recommended that integration should proceed. In October 1975, Kirk's successor Bull Rowling passed the Private Schools Conditional Integration Act, PSCIA. In 1976, Wesley College officially became the first state integrated school. While pleased with the act, private schools were reluctant to make the necessary changes for integration, as a change of government or ideology could remove the integration option at any point. Catholic bishops were particularly concerned that protections for special character could be removed from the act. So, in 1977, an amendment was made to bind the Crown, guaranteeing stability and certainty for all schools who signed up. This act shall bind the Crown. During the first 3 years of the 1980s, Catholic bishops signed the individual integration agreements for their schools. However, the huge costs of bringing the schools up to standard and maintaining them was not financially possible for most schools. In response to this problem, Minister of Education Russell Marshall provided 100% suspensory loans to the value of $18 million per year to support schools in their transition. In 1989, Prime Minister David Lange considered unilaterally changing integration agreements made with proprietors, but advice that the binding clause added in 1977 rendered this illegal caused a rethink, and he decided against it. Over the next decade, integrated schools struggled to maintain their schools to the state standard, as the promised support for ongoing maintenance by the government was never delivered. Finally, in October 1998, Minister of Education Wyatt Creech introduced Policy 1 funding, which, for the first time, allowed state-integrated schools to receive the support promised in the PSCI Act signed over 20 years ago. In 2016, the government agreed to fund a minimum of 85% of costs state-integrated schools faced from property costs resulting from changes in government policy. And, as part of that, the Association of Proprietors of Integrated Schools received $20 million to recompense proprietors for past policy changes that created property issues. In 2017, the national government updated the Education Act, excluding the government from any responsibility to pay for special character training for teachers in integrated schools. In 2019, the government allocated an additional $400 million in maintenance costs for state schools. Integrated schools, however, were excluded. APIS began a conversation with the Minister of Education to rectify this omission. In 2020, the Education and Training Act was passed, and the government used this as an opportunity to make changes to the PSCIA, but negotiations by the Association of Proprietors of Integrated Schools ensured that the original Integration Act was subsumed in its entirety, protecting the rights of integrated schools and their proprietors. In 2021, after threat of legal action over their exclusion from the $400 million maintenance cost allocation in 2019, integrated schools were granted $52.8 million in the budget that year, an acknowledgement that integrated schools must be treated as state schools under the PSCIA. And this is the landscape we find ourselves in today. The Integration Act of 1975 gave state integrated schools relative certainty about their place in Aotearoa's education system, as well as choice and equitable opportunities for our students. This is our taonga, and we stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. By understanding their journey and honouring the spirit of the Act, we protect it for future generations.